Don't worry, I'll still be your fan.
Oh, good. Blow this way, then. That's better.
Okay, here we go.
This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were 3 gables, 5 orange pips, and a sign of 4, but there are hundreds of other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about how much money Holmes actually collected from the Duke of Holderness? Or why Watson constantly had to read the telegrams to him?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 394, Silver Blaze, an Identification. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, I can identify you by sight these days.
Oh, really? You don't have your
Yes.
dark glasses on, huh?
What? What? I can't see you.
That's how people like to see me.
Yes, that's what you may expect to see when you don't see me.
I always go into a dark closet to have my photo taken.
I like it. I'm going to take you up on that advice. It's my favorite kind of selfie.
Yeah, it's terrific. It's why all the pictures of me look like a coat hanger.
All mine look like I kept the lens cap on. Well, we are here in this episode 394 to talk with you about an old piece of Sherlockian scholarship. We do this once a month, where we have an episode under the title of Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist. We take a piece of old Sherlockian scholarship and resurface it because you may not have access to it. You may not have heard about it. Maybe you haven't thought about it in years, even if you are a tried and true Sherlockian. This one comes from the 1949 Volume 4, Number 1 issue of the Baker Street Journal. This is the final issue of the Baker Street Journal before it closed down for 3 quarters. We have those missing 3 quarters as its overproduced version decided, the publisher decided that the overproduced version just was too expensive and was not accomplishing things the way they wanted to. So this is that final issue, and we found a piece by J. Finley Christ called Silver Blaze, an Identification, looking at who was Silver Blaze in real life. You know, how did Watson disguise this horse, and what internal clues can we take to identify the horse ourselves? So it's going to be an interesting discussion here as we go through J. Finley Christ's piece. Just a reminder, you can get the show notes for the episode at SherlockHolmesPodcast.com or right there in the show notes of whatever podcast app you happen to be listening to us on. And for our Patreon and Substack supporters, guess what? We have a surprise for you. Not only do you automatically get entered at the end of every month to be part of a drawing for a Baker Street Journal back issue, but this episode, it's a video episode. You can actually see me and Burt together if you're really curious about what it looks like behind the scenes of this creation. What say you, sir?
I say it's something for which the world is not yet ready.
Well, we'll see. We'll see what the response is like.
Yeah.
If you like the video, let us know. Maybe we'll do more. We're experimenting here. And we don't have our lab coats on, so I want you to be careful. We do have glasses on, but they're not safety glasses. So please be careful with sharp objects. Be careful with any heat. Bert, make sure you're holding on to the guardrail around there as you get up and wander about the room.
That's it.
So
Friends, unfortunately, we have to tell you, if you look at the video of this episode of Trifles, it's something that you will not be able to unsee.
It is something, I'll tell you that. Well, let's get right to it, shall we? Okay, we promised you J. Finley Christ, and J. Finley Christ you shall have. This is called Silver Blaze and Identification, parentheses, as of 1893 A.D. So, Bert, why don't you get us kicked off with that enigmatic title?
I want to kick it off by telling our listeners a little bit about who J. Finley Christ was. He was born in 1884. He was a professor of law at the University of Chicago for 30 years. He was a Sherlockian scholar. He created the system of abbreviations which shorten in 4 letters the titles of the 60 Sherlock Holmes cases, which was published for the first time in his book in 1947, An Irregular Guide to Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street. He began to be interested in the BSI when he read Vincent Starrett's article in Books Alive in the Chicago Tribune. He wrote to Starrett, who invited him to join the BSI in 1949, and his investiture was The Final Problem, the investiture that today is held by Ira Metetsky. J. Finley Christ was a member of a great number of Sherlockian societies. He gave 2 series of lectures in his University of Chicago, The Life and Times of Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street, all in 1946 and 1947. He contributed articles to the Chicago Tribune. He edited booklets. He died on the 10th of December, 1963 at 79. And in 1964, the BSI awarded him a posthumous 2-shilling award. Yes, and you've got a photograph of him in the video. He's got a very memorable appearance, absolutely magnificent. I wish I could have known J. Finley Christ. So let's get started with Silver Blaze and identification. And all you need to know about J. Finley Christ is just this first paragraph, which just tells you all there is to know about the mind of this man. Just listen to this. Upon his first reading of the great story of Silver Blaze in the Strand magazine for December of 1892, the contemporary student of the then small but growing corpus of the great saga may well have felt his curiosity aroused by this new tale of the versatile Dr. Watson. Such a student might have passed over the obvious incongruity of the running of a disguised horse as allowable under literary license, and he would have understood the use of false names for horse owner, trainer, and even race in the interest of avoidance of the laws of libel. But he might nevertheless have been incited to wonder whether there was a real horse at the back of the story. And that, friends, is 2 sentences written by J. Finley Christ.
Oh, maybe we can get a third if we're lucky here.
But isn't that fabulous? How he puts those words together, and what's condensed in there. The obvious incongruity of the running of a disguised horse, well, literary license. False names for horse owner, trainer, and even race, well, avoiding libel. But is there a real horse at the back of the story? Well, as the title of this would suggest, J. Finley Christ has the answer.
We are going to identify said horse. Yeah. So Holmes told us that Silver Blaze was from the isonomy stock, not somomy, as some of the American editions have it, and holds a record as brilliant as that of his famous ancestor. Silver Blaze, now in his 5th year, has brought in each turn of the prizes of the turf to Colonel Ross, his fortunate owner. Up to the time of the catastrophe, he was the first favorite for the Wessex Cup. He's always been a favorite with the racing public and has never yet disappointed them. So Silver Blaze finally won the race too, coming, as we would say, or going away with a rush. He passed the post at a good 6 lengths ahead of his rival. Can we find a horse, Christ asks. Can we find a horse, a real horse, which may fairly be said to fit into this picture? So, isonomy was certainly well known, famous, and real enough to satisfy the story. He won in Cambridgeshire at Newmarket, one of the toughest races of its kind, as a 3-year-old in 1878. Was already a marked horse. In 1879, as a 4-year-old, isonomy took the Manchester Plate from a strong field of 20 horses, the Ascot Gold Cup, and 3 other major races. In 1880, he took the Ascot Gold Cup for a 2nd time, which very few horses have been able to do. And even apart from his subsequent record at the stud, isonomy's place in the racing annals was already securely and forever fixed by his own performances on the turf.
Well, down to the year 1892 when Silver Blaze was published, there was but one really outstanding horse of the isonomy line, and that horse was by some odd trick of fate named Common. But he was far from justifying that name. And Christ tells us it's upon the horse Common that our nomination falls for prototype of Silver Blaze. Well, how does he support this? He tells you how he would support it. You could, he says, turn to the 1893 yellow-backed volumes of Whitaker's Almanac, which were on the shelf at 221B when Watson was writing. And in those pages, the first appearance of Common is in the volume for 1892, Whitaker Almanac, the very year Watson wrote Silver Blaze, says Christ. And in summary of sports for the year 1891, there is all of the pertinent facts. Sired by isonomy, out of Thistle, Common was foaled in 1888. When he was a 3-year-old, practically the horse of the year, coming to the 2,000 Guinea Stakes as an outsider, with no 2-year-old performance to herald his greatness. He wins that race in April. In the Derby, he again wins easily. In the St. James Palace Stakes at Ascot, he wins in a canter. His only disappointment to his following was the loss of the Eclipse Stakes, but even that is a close race. So he completes the year and his racing career, winning the St. Leger at Doncaster in September 1891, where the odds on him were 5-4. Following that race, Common was sold for 15,000 guineas and taken out of training. He had won the Triple Crown, the 2,000, the Derby, and the St. Leger. And he might fairly have been called, as Holmes called Silver Blaze, the most remarkable horse in England.
That is astounding, especially since he did it at a canter. I would have thought doing it at a rabbi would be much easier.
No, that was any canter.
So, Chris says, so if you're a curious student, you would have turned to the Illustrated London News for 1891, and there on page 480 is a reproduction of a drawing of Common, together with a picture of the man who just bought him, John Blundell Maple MP for Camberwell. The drawing is not so clear as it might be, but the horse apparently had a mottled right foreleg, just like Silver Blaze. There's no blaze on his forehead, but this could be due to the possibility that when the drawing was made, the horse hadn't been washed in those spirits of wine that Holmes used to clean Silver Blaze off. And then previously on page 479 of the same publication, there's a whole column about the horse, the man, and the stables. So, putting all of this information together, you might ask, well, where were the Mapleton stables? right? The refuge of Silver Blaze. In reality, the Falmouth House stables of Mr. Maple? And was the horse bought and retired so young to cover up the scandal? Of course. Finley Christ says Mr. Maple, either as an MP or as an honorable racing man, would have nothing to do with these kinds of transactions. That's got to be certain. But again, curiously, the name Mapleton, which is thinly disguised as Capleton in the English editions of Silver Blaze for the stables, certainly doesn't detract from the plausibility of our identification. And the whole account is indicative of the influence of the current news upon the writings of Dr. Watson.
Common then, says Christ, was a very great horse of the isonomy stock. His turf record was even better, though shorter than that of his famous ancestor. His career fits neatly into the picture of Silver Blaze, and the timing of the story would have been acceptable to the student of December 1892. It would even have allowed for the publication of the memoirs of Watson, to which Holmes referred. Now, there are some discrepancies between the two records, to be sure, but even then, even in 1892 or 3, we could have charged them to Dr. Watson's already established carelessness. Common was not in his 5th year, but in his 4th, as a 3-year-old in 91. But he was in his 5th when Watson wrote in 92. The odds at Doncaster were 5-4, as Watson said, but the odds were on Common, not against him. The St. Leger was run on Wednesday, September 9 at Doncaster, and not on a Tuesday at Winchester. And Common had let his public down at least once in the Eclipse Stakes. In whatever wise these minor incongruities may or may not be resolved, it seems sound to assume that the most careful student in 1892 or 3 would have been quite willing to be convinced that the horse in Watson's story was only a thinly concealed, a famous, and a truly great Common. It is obvious.
And that's interesting, because what Christ is doing here is he's putting us in the shoes of the present-day reader, the reader that would have received the Strand magazine in the mail or at the newsstand as it was published, as Watson had written it. And this is a different mindset than those of us looking back historically, because they were living in the moment. They knew the London Illustrated News. They knew the sports news. So this would have been very believable for anyone in that present day when Watson was writing to think of Common as that horse.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that...
So, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, he then says a student of later years will remember that Holmes disappeared in the spring of 1891. That would have been the goings-on in The Final Problem, his disappearance at Reichenbach Falls. This would have taken place a year after Silver Blaze took place in 1890, but a year before the story of Silver Blaze appeared in print. And this is key, because we're crossing the chronology with the publication date. And there's a little difference there. And again, this is 1949, so Christ is working before any of the major chronologies have come out. But he says it may now seem that, as you're looking back, it may now seem that he could not have been on hand for the St. Leger in September of that year. In other words, Holmes and Watson would not have been at the September 9th, 1891 race at St. Leger. But the expert must also remember that in 1893, readers of the Strand had no inkling of the momentous events at the Reichenbach. He references his Uncle Charlie, who knew of these events, because he had been at the Reichenbach when they befell. And I know of them, as I've related elsewhere. My uncle told me the story on the bank of Doyle's Creek in the summer of 1892. But that, as the record of the archives will show, is another story. So when The Final Problem appeared in print in December of 1893, the careful reader must have been puzzled. Perhaps he was tempted to assign the events at the Reichenbach to some other year. Perhaps he'd read Mycroft Holmes into the two instances in Silver Blaze when Holmes's first name is used by Watson. Perhaps he had no solution at all. But he must have been tempted again when, a long time afterward, when Wisteria Lodge was published with a distinct and specific reference to the year 1892. By that time, perhaps the student would have thought that Holmes had disappeared for only 3 months in 1891 instead of 3 years. Who knows?
Who knows? Well, J. Finley Christ knows, and it's amazing that in the course of this essay, in an environment, in a series of adventures, that we are familiar with unreported cases. The author, Christ, introduces a new one about his Uncle Charlie, who apparently was at Reichenbach, and refers to the fact that this has been written up and is in Edgar Smith's archives. Now that's a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Silver Blaze is from isonomy stock.
Isonomy.
And holds as brilliant a record as his famous ancestor. He's now in his 5th year and has brought in turn each of the prizes of the turf to Colonel Ross's fortunate owner,